Thank you, Gabrielle, for turning on your camera. And in fact, it is 3 o'clock Amman time. So we will go ahead and get started because we needed to have the session started. In fact, Patricia, I'm looking at you because it keeps asking me to admit people, but I'm going to assume that you will do that. Okay, sorry. Right, so welcome everybody to Clinic 4B, preparing our social protection system for future shocks in times of COVID-19 and beyond. And it's very much around working with the humanitarian sector. What does that look like? How do we do it? My name is Zara Rizvi. I am currently, I work for UNICEF MENA, Middle East and North Africa. I am their shock responsive social protection and humanitarian cash transfer specialist, so wearing both hats on the social protection side and the humanitarian side. This event was organized and is being hosted by Space, and we have two of our Space colleagues here who I will be introducing to you shortly, and we have them sort of as a default expert team here, whereas everybody here is meant to be an expert. So Space's social protection approaches to COVID-19, and it is funded by Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, formerly also known as DFID, before the merger, and not GIZ, but the German Development Agency as well. So thank you, Space, for doing that. We also have Transform and Maria Laura, instead of telling us everything that there is to know about Transform, if we can instead just have it written into the chat box, because I want to use as much time as possible for the session to get into that. We also have the online community for social protection in crisis contexts. And if anybody is here from the online community, if you can also please type into the chat box how you can join that online community on sp.org. And finally, I'm trying to think, is there anybody before I talk about the Grand Bargain subgroup? Cash subgroup on linking social protection and humanitarian cash transfers. I used to work for them. They've asked me to come in to be able to facilitate this, and that is your list of organizers. I promise from this point forward, I will talk a little bit slower. Just needed to get all that admin out of the way. We would like to request everybody, if it is possible, please turn on your camera so that we can see your faces. We want this as much as possible to be a session where we are sharing with each other. We do have two people from the Space team here. Daniel Longhurst. Daniel, if you can just wave, thank you. And Karen Seifert, if you can just wave as well. The thing that we have decided amongst ourselves is that if we can, first we will look at the different questions that we have, but what we would like to do is open it up to everybody else first, before we have our Space colleagues come in. If something is left, to discuss, or if there's another angle, if they have another example, because we know we have a lot of amazing experts here with us right now. I can see Gabriel Fernandez and his brilliant work that he's done over the years, a lot of it in Liberia, but not just Liberia. I see Jean-Louis Lambeau as well from the ILO, and I know that he's got a lot of great information to be able to bring to this as well. Catherine from World Vision, Diana from WFP in Malawi, I think it is. My colleague Luisa Lippi from UNICEF from the regional office over there. I think, yes, there's Luisa as well. If I can just ask people, Claire O'Brien, also from the social protection team over in the headquarters in WFP, I want to be able to acknowledge everybody, but we will be sitting here all day. So let's use the chat function as much as possible. If people can please be introducing themselves as well, because part of this is about networking with each other also. And we want to be able to make sure that we do that. I see CALP colleagues as well. Hi, Lynn, nice to see you. So what we are going to do is start, and Patricia, if I can please ask you to put in the Slido link so everybody can take a look at that. I will also share my screen once I figure out how to share my screen. Sorry, give me a second to be able to do this. Oh, okay. I can do this. I do know how to share a screen. Once I figure out how to share the screen, but everybody can get to that Slido, because we do have quite a few questions there already that we want to be able for all of you to, like, literally, why is this not showing up? Okay, there we go. Ta-da, you should be able to see the screen, right? So here we go. We've got the Slido. These are the kinds of questions that we had coming up. We have run this clinic once already in the morning. And, you know, one of the questions that we really looked at quite a bit was around the essential actions to prepare a social protection system. I'm going to ask everybody to take a look at this and upvote the questions that you really want us to be able to talk about right now. We also have, and I wonder if I can do this. So after the clinic, what we will be doing is we have a Google Doc, and it is the discussion forum. You can see that some of these questions already we have started putting in here. What are the essential actions, etc. You know, we have already started answering some of these questions, and it's not just, you know, that it's the space colleagues doing it or it's me. I'm definitely not doing it. But, you know, anybody can go in, and we really want to treat it as a discussion forum. So these are your two links, and I'm going to give people about a minute or two to take a look at the different questions that we have. If you upvote them or come up with your own questions, we can make sure to take a look at those questions as we speak right now. So the essential actions is the big one. Coordination is another one that has come up quite a bit in different sorts of configurations, but coordination is one that we feel like we have to be able to talk about also. And let's look at recent. So social registries, I see nobody has actually put up anything right now immediately. Sorry, I'm just refreshing the screen, and I will stop sharing my screen. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, and then people can see which questions they would like to be able to answer. William Martin is looking for a link, and I'm guessing that's the link for the Slido, and there we go. There's the Slido link. And William, nice to have you here from USAID Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, Sarah Blinn, Oxfam Nepal. Welcome, good to see you here. Those are the only two people who have actually introduced themselves. Maybe other people want to be able to also introduce themselves a little bit. Okay, and if we look at the Slido, the big question that we are getting is, so we can start with this question, and then we, as in Daniel, myself, and Karen, will keep an eye on the Slido and see where we get in terms of next questions. But the question then that we are going to pose to everybody is, where a government and its partners are interested to prepare the social protection system for future shocks, what are the essential actions that are needed to move forward? And I'm okay with silence. And I've asked Daniel and Karen to also be okay with silence. Because, you know, if that's the only way that we're going to encourage people to be able to share their experiences, to come forward and, you know, tell us your experiences. Gabrielle, I see your mic is unmuted, and go ahead and introduce yourself. And yeah, and we'll take your answer.
Okay. My name is Gabriel Fernandez. I'm currently a social protection specialist freelancing. I have had opportunity to work for the government as a national coordinator for social protection. And before that, to have worked with UNICEF as a child protection officer. So I basically wear two hats in this capacity. It's a privilege to be here and to be part among such sterling social protection activists and practitioners. The question that has been posed, I think is a question that we had to deal with in Liberia during the Ebola crisis. And so learning from that experience is to say that the very first thing was around having a good, first of all, I think from the side of the humanitarian actors, it's important to have a good understanding of government and how they work and the government structures. In other words, from national all the way down to subnational in terms of operation. Secondly, to know which is the lead ministry that is responsible for social protection action, and to work with that ministry in terms of enhancing their capacity to be able to strengthen coordination, because coordination, I would say, is key. And for many humanitarian actors, maybe the entry point will be the entry point in terms of their interaction with government. And once you have established this entry point, is to come up with clear memorandum of understanding and terms of reference for the coordination in terms of roles and responsibilities, who would do what. And humanitarian actors bring to the table, at least for government, that's what our experience, very important skills and knowledge to the government. And so it's that added value that you can bring in terms of, very clear example, vulnerability and market analysis, different tools in terms of mapping, of stakeholders mapping, which is very, very important. And so these are skills that helps the government and also enhances the credibility and said that you're dealing with a partner that brings added value to your work. So this partnership is basically, making yourself relevant to helping government in becoming more effective in their work. And of course, everybody likes success. So that partnership is a partnership of collaboration and success. So it's the various tools and knowledge that you bring and the partnership. I know they were very concerned looking at some of the questions as to will it infringe on how humanitarian principles and guidance? And I think one of the key elements is do no harm. And I think even for government, that should be also an important principle, do no harm. Now, of course, it may vary when you're dealing with countries where there's a situation of conflict. So in a situation where you're dealing with conflict, obviously, the principle, the humanitarian principle becomes more important because you're trying to ensure there's non-bias in terms of the population that you're trying to reach. But in a situation of shock, and like the case COVID, basically is how do you maximize coverage? How do you avoid duplication? And the terms of reference that you establish can help you actually put all that into place.
Thank you so much. So much of what you're saying in terms of preparedness is around the groundwork and creating this enabling environment to be able to work alongside, for the two sectors to work alongside. I see a hand raised, which I think is brilliant. And I know it says Maria Laura, but you are not Maria Laura. So if you would like to just unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. This is Patience Matandiko from Zambia ILO office. Actually, I'm a colleague to Maria Aurora. We are working together on the Transform, and I've been working with the ILO, I think, for the past 7 years on supporting government in development and preparation and enhancing social protection systems in Zambia. Maybe just to add on to the previous speaker in terms of some of the other things that can be taken into account is that there is need also to understand the key entry points. And by that, I mean that there is need for recognition of what is already existing and happening on the ground. What is the current system? So that from that system, then there should be an understanding among the partners to see what each and every partner is bringing to the table. What are the resources that are available that we can leverage? I can give an example of what we are doing in the Zambian context, where we are supporting government as a UN system in implementation of an emergency cash transfer that has taken into account the existing beneficiaries that are already on the social protection programs, on the social cash transfers, meaning that what we are doing actually is to leverage the systems and all the infrastructure and the capacities that are already existing within the implementation and the programming of the social cash transfer. On the other hand, we are also trying to expand. We are calling it a horizontal expansion, where we are trying to improve also and cover and provide a temporal cash transfer to those people that are not ordinarily, ideally, social cash transfer beneficiaries, but they are benefiting they are among the informal economy workers. And through that, we are also using other partners that are in the social security or pensions industry. We are using the infrastructure and the partnerships that we have already created with associations that are working in the informal industry. So I just wanted to amplify the point that also looking at what is already existing and consistent stakeholders engagement is very, very important, because it also suffices to say that this particular actually endeavor has not come without challenges. It has its own challenges, but what is key is to consistently engage and ensure that there is a focal point institution or leadership from one institution that should try to bring together all these different partners that are working on combining the social protection and also the humanitarian interventions. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you so much, Patience. Jean-Louis, I see your hand, but yeah, I mean, we're now talking about two different sorts of topics, which I think is great, because any of this without coordination, forget about it, you know, and it's one of the big issues that keeps coming up. And, you know, how do we look at it? And I love that we have so many donors actually, and donors who, at least on the humanitarian side, are trying to figure out how to work with this issue. I'm not sure, and if somebody is super cool and can actually go onto Google and find the Grand Bargain Cash work stream and the commitments that humanitarian actors at least have signed up to. Coordination is the one that gets the least amount of scoring. It's one of the biggest, hardest problems that we have. And now we have added the social protection side to it and said, who is going to coordinate? You know, and it has been a consistent issue in countries since COVID, since the COVID social protection scale up that happened very quickly, where it's like, who is going to coordinate? How are we going to do this? So thank you, Patience and Gabriel, for starting up that coordination conversation. Jean-Louis, over to you, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Zara. And okay, so yeah, coordination, of course, is a bit the tarte à la crème of the humanitarian world. You know, it's about coordination, of course, or coordination. But I liked very much Gabriel's words, you know, when he started to talk about, to introduce a bit the topic, and he related to the notion of partnership. And of course, coordination is part of it. Partnership might maybe be a bit broader vision, because I think that Patience laid out a picture of something that is happening, an implementation process, which is currently happening with a lot of people working together and so on. So of course, coordination, but it's, I think, quite useful to also try to take a step backward when looking at those humanitarian emergency response and preparedness cycle and prevention and so on, and to try to understand this in the longer run. Because after all, when emergency strikes, it's already too late to set up those mechanisms. You have to put them in place in emergency if they are not there already. So it's better to talk about it. This is an opportunity to talk about it in terms of normal proceeding. So the time frame is very important. So to put all these mechanisms together is directly related to the notion of partnership, but also coordination of policy, of sectors, different sectors. So I believe this is a pretty complex issue, and it is a process-oriented thing. If you tackle the notion of climate change, for example, you look at the very long-term impacts and very long-term processes you will have to involve the people from different policy areas, not only humanitarian, not only social protection per se, but also environment and the world of work in general, enterprises. The notion of having a dialogue between all these entities seems to me quite important as a starting point. So at the ILO, we refer to it as a social dialogue or something like that. That would also, of course, all the actors together, beyond the employers and employees, all these other actors, humanitarians, and so on. At a certain point, it's about acknowledging the potential occurrence of disasters in the future. Those disasters will grow, will increase in scale and frequency, most probably. And we'll ask different parts of the governments and institutions to work together. So yes, coordination, but also maybe scaling up a bit this notion of partnership and time frame altogether to enter in a discussion where you have the right actors and try to tackle the right policy questions as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jean-Louis, for that. And, looking at it as a system and as different partners. And, we can debate, what partnership actually means, because a lot of times between donors and implementers, let's say, it's never quite that equal partnership that perhaps an implementing partner is looking for. Cecilia, I absolutely see your hand. And I'm going to also ask people if they can introduce themselves before they start speaking so that we know who you are, where you're coming from. And Cecilia, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cecilia Costela. I'm a senior technical advisor on social protection. I work at the Climate Center, and I also do some freelance work as well with some of you as well. So I'm going to change a little bit the topic from coordination and partnership. I hope that's okay.
We're going all over the place right now, so it's totally fine. Go for it.
Going back to that question of, what needs to be in place if the government wants to implement or put in place a shock response social protection system. And I think for me, one of the questions that also links to the second question that has been most voted, which is about when not to do shock responsive social protection. I think one of the first questions to talk about is what type of shocks are we aiming to respond to through a social protection system? How does this build on the existing humanitarian system? How does it improve the response by the humanitarian system? And to make sure that what we're doing really is building a shock response social protection system and not a way to address chronic vulnerabilities through, ad hoc shock responsive systems as in a way sometimes it has happened with humanitarian aid. So I think the question of what type of shocks we're talking about when we talk about shock response social protection and what type of vulnerability we're talking about addressing through these systems is quite important. And I think this also links to the point that Jean-Louis was making about, climate in particular, sort of considering the long-term range of vulnerabilities created by climate change and sort of think about that as well in terms of, what can you do to address the chronic problems and what you can do to kind of build a shock responsive system, because this also has implications for the financing of the system, right? You can't
Absolutely.
keep responding to shocks if you don't work on reducing the vulnerability.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And if you want to keep your camera on, nobody's complaining, but okay. Yeah, it's just a little bit more engaging than just looking at, everybody's black screen right now. Luisa, I'm going to ask you to come in, and if you can just introduce yourself really, really quickly, and then we'll take your intervention.
Sure. My name is Louisa Lippi. I'm the social policy specialist focusing on social protection for UNICEF's office in Europe and Central Asia. And I do technical support to the 21 countries in that region on strengthening social protection systems with the focus right now on the shock responsive aspect. So what we've been finding over the past 3 years on the focus on preparedness actions is that really, and I picking up on some of the points that the other panelists have or participants have raised, is looking at the system. So UNICEF has developed an assessment tool that is pretty comprehensive and provides a picture of what are the gaps coming out. Because again, whatever the essential actions are that you will need to put in place really need to respond to the gaps that are in that current system. So, you know, for the most part, all of the systems that we've assessed in the region, which have been 7 so far, have had different strengths and weaknesses, and then you have to build on those specifically. So assessing the maturity or the readiness of the system is really essential to see where you need to come in and focus your support. And doing this in a partnership way across organizations is also really instrumental and useful, because it helps to identify, you know, where different organizations can come in on their comparative advantage to help build the system. And it makes it more of a easier process for the government, because you're not having various donors and agencies coming in trying to work on different things. So having an assessment done at the beginning, I think, has been really useful, especially for this current crisis. And then one of the things that we have been seeing that has been coming out across the different assessment tools has been on the targeting and the beneficiary registry systems. So you know, they're not always easy to expand. The way that they do the targeting is sometimes very cumbersome. And so having a specific look at the targeting and how you register people into the systems and linking them to the payment modalities has been something that we've been working on across the region based on the assessments that we've done. To help respond to this current crisis, but then going forward for the future shocks as well. So that's
And
just
it's a question of clarification, Louisa. The assessments you guys had done before the crisis, or assessments?
They were all done before.
This
so they
is
were
the SRSP UNICEF
Yes.
guidance that you'd already done in all 21
Yes.
countries?
in 7. So we did 2 in
Okay.
2017. We did 3 in 2018 and another 2 in 2019.
Cool. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for that. And I'm well aware. Right now, I'm not wearing any hat. I do work for UNICEF, but right now I'm just going to put any hat aside for the time being. I have used a UNICEF tool, but and I used it from the government side of things. But what I did was merge it with the WFP tool. So I know at least 2 WFP people are here. I cannot see the whole entire list, but it would be good to hear from you guys as well in terms of, has that tool and any different countries that you may have used the social protection readiness tool, what that might have looked like. Has it helped? Because, you know, we keep talking about what are the essential actions for preparedness, etc. Sarah Blinn, I do see you, but before I move on to you, I just want to do a quick sort of wrap up, and I'm going to look at Karen and Daniel if they want to add anything in terms of what people have said already. But we have touched a range of different topics right now, you know, looking at, yes, the key sort of essential preparedness actions, and some of them are more on the partnership coordination side of things. We had some operational aspects also being talked about. Very much appreciated, Louisa, that you were talking about the targeting. Also, you know, the systems and what are they meant to be responding to? You know, are we looking at vulnerabilities? What kind of shocks are we looking at? How are the systems currently set up? What are they meant to respond to? Should they be responding to every single shock or not? So I think there's a lot of different interesting threads that we've come onto. Karen and Daniel, yes, Karen, you are unmuted, so go for it. Is there any sort of 1-minute thing that you want to add? It could be no as well, but if there's anything you want to add from what you've heard so far.
I don't have anything to add. I just want to really second Cecilia's point about knowing what your objectives are. Like, so what kind of shocks and what kind of vulnerabilities. I think that was a really well stated and the most important, but that's all from my side.
Brilliant. Daniel, anything to add? amazing. We can't hear you. You are like totally unmuted, but somehow we can't hear you. Oh, that's weird. Nope, can't hear you. But that is okay. All right, so you're just gonna, yeah, you can use the chat box function. If you have things, just go ahead and stick them in. So Sarah, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself, unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and yeah, we'll take your comments.
Thanks a lot. So my name is Sarah Blin. I'm the country director for Oxfam in Nepal. And I just wanted to share our experience regarding, in fact, the domestic law on humanitarian response. The issue we faced in Nepal is that for COVID, we were not allowed to use social protection or cash transfers because it did not fall for the Nepal government under emergency, like the emergencies that we've known so far. And during the period of the lockdown, there was an incidence of floods and landslides. And for floods and landslides, we could use cash transfers because that was part of the disaster law. And I think for me, part of the preparedness is really looking at domestication of humanitarian principles and humanitarian laws so that, you know, from a constitutional perspective, it can trickle down to other bodies of law. So that's a really macro concept at national level, but I think it's often overlooked. And it was especially relevant in Nepal because the cluster system has been nationalized. So all the clusters are led by representatives of different ministries and co-led by the HCT reps and the NGO community. So I just wanted to bring this point in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, I mean, that's so interesting. So social protection was not seen as a response tool?
No, there was an explicit veto from the Ministry of Finance to not use cash during the lockdown period, neither to respond to the migrant influx nor to respond to the economic impact of the lockdown inside the country. And this is because in Nepal, I think, although this was not said officially, there's a sense that cash carries a political value. And that if you distribute cash, it may be to collect votes. And it's been a debate for every emergency, at least that I've experienced in Nepal. But at the same time, the same ministry is very supportive of social protection, but not as a mechanism to respond to an economic crisis, at least. I mean, to the point that actually some transfers were suspended at exactly the same time as the initiation of the lockdown, which is still under discussion, actually. But in contrast, repatriating migrants back into Nepal, which was regulated by law, that was made possible thanks to the constitutional provisions. And some countries, you know, the legal framework is really the most powerful tool for action. And I think we, as humanitarians, we really tend to overlook this. But if we could do more work on domestic humanitarian law, I think that would really help in using social protection in response.
Yeah, and some of your best advocates for that are the National Red Cross Society, because they tend to be the auxiliary for the government on the disaster management side, and it tends to go in from, so it is, again, coming back to that whole entire theme of partnerships and what we're looking at. And Sarah, you can just nod your head or put it inside the chat box because I want to give others a chance to speak. But if I understand correctly, it was the cash transfers, because social protection is social assistance, social insurance, and then, you know, what is it, the labor market policies, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't necessarily social protection that was not being used for response. It was cash transfers specifically that because of them being seen as a political interference, et cetera, that perhaps they were not being advocated for by the Ministry of Finance. And any sort of information, et cetera, around that, I think would be super interesting. And if you can link to that in the chat box. Sorry, Nakata, I think you wanted to come in. Claire, I do see your hand, but I had seen you unmute yourself a while ago, but I don't necessarily see that happening anymore. So for right now, yeah, go ahead, Nakata.
Yes, thank you, Zara. My name is Nkatan Toburi. I'm a social protection specialist with FAO and also a Transform trainer. So I have 2 points to raise. One is with regards to the fragile and protracted state. I've had an opportunity to work in Somalia, and you will find that there's a conversation around how to transition humanitarian caseloads, humanitarian assistance to social protection interventions, and you will find that in such in a country like Somalia, the social protection system is currently still being developed. So the question is, how do you transition these caseloads, considering that there is still a huge need for humanitarian assistance? And that brings me to thinking through, how do you define a transition process? You know, who should be transitioned? Which shocks should be covered under humanitarian? Which ones should be covered under social protection or social safety nets? And such questions arise, especially when the systems are still, the social protection system are still not as developed to be able to support a huge caseload, a huge humanitarian caseload. So maybe a conversation around, how do you define a transition process? At what points, at what timelines, what kind of shocks do we assign to humanitarian, and which shocks do we assign to social protection initiatives? And also when we talk about coordination, it's also about how inclusive the coordination systems are. Are we bringing on board the social protection actors in the humanitarian conversation, and vice versa, so that they all understand where the complementarities lie? And finally, as we look at the COVID response, so we have actually made good progress in terms of responding to the immediate needs, the immediate shocks. But what next post-COVID? If, for example, in Somalia, if humanitarian actors have been responding to COVID, maybe their funding is short-term, what next after that? And we do not have in place a social protection system that can actually take in the entire caseloads from the COVID response. So this brings us to conversations around, what do we need to do to ensure that the role of humanitarian actors is just not necessarily with regards to responding to an immediate shock, but also in protracted or fragile states. How can we expand the role of humanitarian actors to be able to provide more longer term assistance that's more sustainable as we build the social protection systems? Thank you.
And is there a bridge agency or bridge sort of situation that's happening in the middle? I think this is a really good question. You know, what do we need to do? And I would add to that, and who is best placed to do it? You know, because you can have several different actors all sort of fighting for the space, which is why coordination is such a nightmare. You know, between the UN agencies, there's a completely different sort of fighting of space that is happening, or competition. I mean, we don't even have to call it fighting or whatever. And then within different NGOs, you will see it. Where's civil society and any of this? Where's actually the local government, or, you know, municipalities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, there's a lot of, you know, I think we can see what needs to be done, but who is best placed to do it? And we can have, like, at the global level, you know, agencies saying we're the lead on XYZ, but, you know, sometimes realities on the ground at the country level tend to be a little bit different. Claire, if you can unmute yourself, say who you are, and then your input, please.
Hi there, thanks, Zara. Hello, everybody. This is Claire O'Brien. I'm in the Social Protection Unit at the World Food Programme headquarters. I had two things to say. One of them is a response to the what you were immediately saying, Zara, about you know, the who gets to do what and how everybody decides, which has been a thread running through quite a lot of the conversation so far. And then I was also just going to revert, you asked a question earlier about the use of WFP's tool for assessing capacity for readiness, and I can give you an answer on that one as well, because it has been used for COVID. On the first point, one of the things that I find really interesting about this whole area of discussion about coordination is that we often see that the debate on shock responsive social protection and the debate on linking humanitarian assistance and social protection appear to many people to be the same debate. But actually, they only feel like they're the same debate if you sit on the humanitarian side of the fence. because you think, well, obviously this whole discussion of social protection is centered around me and how can I use the social protection system to do what I need to do. Whereas if you're sitting in social protection, the question about how to prepare social protection for emergencies doesn't necessarily involve you inviting any international humanitarian actors to the table at all. It could just mean you doing your job better at making sure your social protection program keeps running in an emergency, or the government social protection program might need to be more flexible, or make sure it's got its financing in place and so on. So I just think it's an interesting point that if you are an international humanitarian actor, be aware that other people who are working in this space may not necessarily be expecting that this is a job that's got anything to do with you. I think often when even the questions that were coming up, the question that was upvoted that was very interesting was it's open to many interpretations in terms of what it means to use social protection. I suspect that often what humanitarian agencies mean is we'd like to try and find a way of keeping programs that we can brand as our own programs, but see if we can channel them through social protection, because that's what the Grand Bargain has told us to do. Another thing that one might say in terms of using might actually be stand back, hand over the money and let the social protection program get on with doing its job. Or some combination of that. And so all of these questions about coordination depend on actually what kind of relationship you want these two sides to end up having. So I was just going to throw that out there. It feels to me that often this whole issue about collaboration is something that is humanitarian actors feel is instrumental for them to do their own job, rather than being about working out who's actually supposed to be taking the lead. Just that on your other point, specifically requesting about whether WFP's shock responsive social protection assessment tool had ever been used. It was used, it was used as part of a preparedness exercise in the Dominican Republic last year, where there were plans to use it to understand the state of the system and draw up standard operating procedures for how social protection might be used in the event of an emergency. And then a few months later, COVID has come along, and in fact, the standard operating procedures that were developed were triggered for the COVID response for the Dominican Republic. And I think a report has I'm told a report has literally just come out on that. I'm not even sure if it's online yet. So if I find it, I can share the link, because that is an example where some work that they did a year ago has now been used.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And my hope and dream remains that one day there will be one tool, not a UNICEF tool, not a WFP tool, but one tool, because coming at it from the government side, where both were partners that I was working with, it was super annoying to have two tools. But both brilliant tools, and they both basically say the exact same thing. One is a bit more food focused, one is a bit more kids focused. We need both those focuses. So, it would be wonderful, because this is also a request that comes from governments all the time, is that, agencies that are coming to us. So a social protection agency these days is overrun by humanitarians coming and being like, let us link to you, which is exactly what you're saying, Claire. It is, what is the objective that we as humanitarians might be going in with, etc. And just having better coordination around that as well, and perhaps being better coordinated amongst ourselves in terms of, what is the actual approach. And it's not about using a social protection system, but seeing how that can be supported, and if indeed it is the correct vehicle to be able to use in an emergency. Getachew, I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, and I apologize. There's also some great conversation happening in the chat box, so I would recommend that people take a look at that as well. And I will try and bring in some of those voices also. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Yes, you are. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Zahara. So my name is Getachew. I work for UNICEF Ethiopia country office as a social protection specialist. So I'm here as a transformer. I'm among the master transformer in Africa. So I just want to share some of the example what we are working in terms of linking the existing social protection system with the humanitarian system in Ethiopia. for us, what we are trying currently is we are trying to use, create a strong linkage between the two program. Previously, we had a different program for, emergency or humanitarian support, and then productive safety net, which is cover around 8 million. So what we tried as a donor, there are many donors. There is a donor coordination team between donors, including UNICEF, and from government side, there is a coordination system to link the two, program. So based on that, currently we had a contingency fund within the existing PSNP safety net program. So when there is any kind of shock, especially the focus is on drought actually. So the contingency can be, triggered to be used for any kind of humanitarian support. So we have also local level contingency fund, which is around 5% of every kind of PSNP cash transfer. 5% will be kept for the, local kind of shock. But for the broader shock, we have also a national or like a federal system, contingency system. So through that, most of the, the actors of humanitarian are contributing to the existing system using the same kind of payment system, payment modality, and using the same kind of wage rate. So there was a strong, in terms of creating a strong linkage between the two. We are trying, and government is also contributing to both, to the regular program and similarly for the emergency program. Yeah, so that was just to share some of an example in terms of any kind of shock. If we establish a system where we can, trigger any kind of payment modality targeting system and everything, so we can reduce. Just to share additional one example, when we start to link the two program, we find out in one region, like the number of beneficiary, if you add up both, it's, like above the beneficiary or the regional population because of, lack of coordination. So when we start to, coordinate, we try to find out some kind of any kind of error, including targeting error and other kind of similar experience. So thank you, Zara. Over to you.
Getachew, thank you so much for that. And in fact, there was a session earlier today. My SP.org colleagues can perhaps help me. I want to say it was roundtable 6, perhaps. And we did have a government person from Ethiopia on there talking about the PSNP and very much how, those links between roundtable 5. I have Patricia correcting me on that one, and talking about the PSNP and, the links between the humanitarian side. So it's actually great to come sort of full circle around on that one and to be able to hear it directly from you. We have had a lot now in terms of not just preparedness, but who should be doing what, should they even be doing it, etc. What kind of shocks, when is a shock still a shock? What we noticed in the morning session was, because we left coordination till sort of the end, and there was definitely not enough time to get into it, but perhaps we do need to open it up. Talk about coordination. I feel like we've been going around the issue a bit, and I am going to ask the donors on this group, because there are several of you here, to be able to, tell us, give your perspective on it. We know that it is a problem. We know that donors in the morning, and these are not Chatham House rules, so I can go ahead and say this. We had somebody, FCDO from the Nepal office, chiming in around this, saying, and Irish Aid as well in Zambia, I think it was, where they were talking about it, it was Malawi. And from Nepal, donors will fund coordination positions, because one of the big asks in the beginning was, well, if you want coordination to happen, you're going to have to fund the position. They are funding the position, and they're like, why is this still not working? And I think also early on in the beginning, it was like, who needs to step up and show that kind of leadership in country to be able to bring the two sides together? Who needs to actually be coming in together, etc. So I am, and we can go with awkward silence, no problem. But I would love it if, I'm going to be that person, and I hope you show up to future sessions that I will facilitate. But William from USAID, I do see you here. Isabel, if you are still here. Oh no, I think Isabel, you are still here, and I know new to your position in ECHO. But just to get an idea, I don't know if I'm missing other donors. I did see somebody else from Irish Aid perhaps here as well. So it would be good to be able to get some sort of, just some reflections and thoughts in terms of what does that, what can that look like? What should we be doing? What would be your ideal situation as a donor to be able to see? And I'll just keep an eye out for unmuted microphones.
Hi, Zara.
William. Hi, William.
Yes. How are you doing? Good.
I'm good. How are you?
Thank you. Good. Thank you for the interesting conversation. It's very fruitful conversation this morning.
Yeah.
No, I think as you know from the Kronbergen cash subgroup on humanitarian assistance and social protection linkages, I think there is still a lot of definition, to do to see how humanitarian assistance and social protection could be linked. And I think it's reflected in the discussion we have this morning. And you see progress. I'm following this trend for the past year, for example, since the group was created almost. And I see a lot of attention to the details now, beyond the principle and just the rights. How do we actually operationalize that? On the donor side, I think our demand is still pretty clear. That's from the Kronbergen, right? That's we are expecting, perhaps what we're expecting is for sure a predictable coordination mechanism. I think our demand always has been clear, because a predictable coordination mechanism allow for a more cost-efficient intervention. Now, which form does it take? I believe it's not out of a vacuum, because there is still discussion around the concept, how does linkages with social protection and humanitarian assistance look like? But on the cash coordination side, I think there is a clear call for predictable cash coordination. Over.
Thanks, William. Sabil, I see that you are unmuted, but Isabel, you are also here and able to, we can't hear you, but yeah. Oh, now we can hear you. It's good to see your face again after a while. Hello.
Hello, everyone. I knew Zara would put me on the spot, and I'm only 1 month into my new role, so I would definitely not be clear that I'm not speaking in any formal way on behalf of ECHO. But just to reiterate some of William's points and add a couple more, as part of the Kronbergen Cash Work Stream, and specifically the Donor Cash Forum, as humanitarian donors, we have expressed our desire to see greater linkages with between humanitarian assistance and social assistance, and to see that in a more coordinated way amongst actors, and for us to also, as donors, adopt a more harmonized way of programming in that regard. I think that perhaps as donors, what we could do a better job of as well is working with our humanitarian partners is really communicating about the different financial instruments which may or may not be available within a given context, based on what that context is politically and the implications for that donor government. I think that's definitely something that, as an implementer from the humanitarian side, I often felt was a big gap. And in the work that Zara and I did together as well, looking at knowledge management gaps in this area, that's something that came out quite a lot. And I think in line with that point about greater harmonization and collaboration between actors, certainly would like to see more standardization of tools. And there's great progress in interoperability in humanitarian cash assistance, notably through the UN Common Cash System and the Collaborative Cash Delivery Platform, but to see that also translated into coordination with the government and interoperability when linking with social protection systems would be great as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really good to have you back. Thank you very much for that. And if people have asks of the donors as well right now, if you can just put them in the chat box. I see Karen as well. Arnold Chikavanga, I think Irish Aid Malawi. I did go through the chat and thank you for introducing yourself. I don't know if you wanted to be able to come in quickly. I'm not sure if you are still here, in fact, and yes, we have 5 minutes left to go, but I just want to make sure, because one of the things, and Isabel referenced the work that she and I had done, which we had started doing exactly nearly a year ago, and looking at these knowledge management learning gaps that we had. And one of the things that people said to us over and over and over again is that, donors could fix the coordination problem. And as if somehow there is some magical power, there is definitely some power and some partnership around this that could be happening. But if you have ideas, suggestions, etc. around that, let's put them in the chat box, because I know Karen and Daniel are monitoring that. It will be going into the discussion forum document, etc. So we'll have that. And Karen, I'm going to open up to you. I don't see any other of microphones that are open or any other donors that are coming in. So Karen, go ahead, because I think you've been wanting to say something about this.
I just wanted to maybe challenge the donor community here a little bit, that there's this demand that coordination is something that humanitarian and development actors do with the government, when often donors have quite a lot of convening power with the government vis-a-vis governments. They're often funding both governments and development and humanitarian actors. So, but I've found that there is some reluctance in using that convening power. And I just wanted to ask, how does that look like from the donor perspective?
Right. And I don't know if any donor is going to step up right now and talk about their convening power, if they can. Given that we have like 3 whole minutes left, let's put this as one of those questions that we can put onto, maybe it's something that we can ask in the Grand Bargain. I see my previous boss for the Grand Bargain subgroup on here, and so maybe not put them on the spot, but maybe that is a question that we can bring up in that forum and put it on the different, we've got the social protection and crisis online community, so it could be over there, different forums in which we could try and answer that question. It's a very good question to ask, Karen. Patience, you are probably going to be our last person coming in, and go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I just wanted to make a quick contribution. I think when we are talking about collaboration and coordination, Zura, I think there's one point that we miss, which we have really learned a lot here in Zambia. I mean, we can even learn from starting from, I think, the lower levels of implementation, because we are trying an initiative to implement what we are calling the Single Windows Initiative. And we started last year. I think we've learned quite some lessons that we are also trying to see how can this be replicated even at higher level, at programmatic level, maybe even possibly later on, when they are clearly defined, even at policy and national level. So I think we also need to look at this from both, angles, from the bottom up, on both bottom and up. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Patience, for that, because there's also some excellent chat in the chat box. Kirsten Smart from Oxfam, she is their cash lead. She's also talking about, the role of CSOs and civil societies. And if people have been part of this conference, they will see pretty much in every single session, I'm just like, what about civil society? What about localization? These are incredibly important aspects, social accountability. These are all these things that we have not touched on right now, but what is the role of civil society organizations within this, so how are we building a more bottom-up approach, which is partially, I think, what you were trying to put through, Patience. We have about a minute with a 2-minute grace period that is afforded to us. I would like to thank everybody. Look at Karen and Daniel, who cannot unmute himself for some reason, but Karen, is there anything that you want to add from what has been said?
I thought this was a really interesting debate. I'm really keen to give the floor back to participants because I think this has been one of the most participatory sessions we've had. And I thought that was really great. So rather than hugging the floor, I'd be keen for anybody else to say what else they've had to add, because I feel like my face has been on enough and opinions, papers and panels.
Fair. Very good. Daniel, anything from your side? Realizing, of course, that, yeah, do you want to try? No, okay, we can't hear you. It's fine. Does anybody else? Well, actually, I can't. Yeah, we've got a comment from Arnold. Patricia, if you can please just put the link again for the discussion forum, because this is not over. You can go in to the discussion forum and put your answers, etc., within that. We can continue the conversation. We can continue the discussion. A great place to be able to do that is on the Social Protection and Crisis online community. We are looking at a lot of different sorts of methods in order to keep the conversation going, keep the conversation alive. Cecile, I saw you posting something here, and if you can also please post about the session that you and I are facilitating tomorrow. It's around failing forward, and it's about social protection in crisis. So I am going to do that plug. Come to our session tomorrow. I think it's the same time, but just tomorrow, side event number 5. I want to thank you all so much. It's never easy because we never know what we are going to end up with a big group, but everybody has participated beautifully. I don't know if we answered fully a lot of the questions, but I think just having that space and that conversation and discussion and getting to know each other in the process was, some of the objectives that we had. So yes, continue the conversation. We'll see you in the other sessions that we're going to have. Thank you, sp.org, and happy birthday. But really a massive, massive round of applause for our colleagues at sp.org. I don't think any of them have slept in the last 3 weeks, but thank you very, very much for all your support. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.